shelf. Article 4 defines Somalia's territorial sea as extending to 12 nautical miles and addresses the issue of its delimitation with Kenya, providing in the relevant part of paragraph 6, I quote, "If there is no multilateral treaty, the Somali Democratic Republic shall consider that the border between the Somali Democratic Republic and the Republic of Djibouti and the Republic of Kenya is a straight line towards the sea from the land as indicated on the enclosed charts." End of quote. Somalia has not produced the charts mentioned in the provision, explaining that they may have been lost or destroyed during the Civil War. It maintains that the phrase straight line towards the sea was intended to be equivalent to an equidistant line. Kenya contends that although the meaning of the phrase is unclear, taking Somalia's contemporary practice into account, it should be interpreted as a reference to the parallel of latitude. The court notes that Article 4, Paragraph 6 of the Maritime Law also refers to the delimitation of maritime areas in relation to the Republic of Yemen, employing the phrase a median line. The phrase a straight line towards the sea is not clear, and without the charts mentioned, its meaning cannot be determined. Somalia did not react immediately to the 2005 proclamation. However, its view was made clear on several occasions in 2009. As noted earlier, the MOU concluded that year between the parties referred to an unsettled maritime dispute. Somalia's 2009 submission of preliminary information to the CLCS reproduces the text of the MOU and indicates that unresolved questions remain in relation to the bilateral delimitation of the continental shelf with neighboring states. In addition, in a letter dated 19 August 2009 and addressed to the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Prime Minister of Somalia maintained that the delimitation of the continental shelf has not yet been settled, further stating that, I quote, "It would appear that Kenya claims an area extending up to the latitude of the point where the land border reaches the coast, while instead, in accordance with the international law of the sea, an equidistance line normally constitutes the point of departure for the delimitation of continental shelf between the two states with adjacent coasts. Somalia bases itself on the latter view." End of quote. Further, as noted by the court in the 2017 judgment, in 2014, Somalia objected to the consideration by the CLCS of Kenya's submission on the ground that there existed a maritime boundary dispute between itself and Kenya. Somalia withdrew its objection in 2015, noting that the dispute had been submitted to the court. Finally, the court cannot ignore the context of the civil war that afflicted Somalia, depriving it of a fully operational government and administration between 1991 and 2005. These circumstances were public and notorious, and they were also recognized by Kenya in the previous phase of the proceedings. This context needs to be taken into account in evaluating the extent to which Somalia was in a position to react to Kenya's claim during this period. For the foregoing reasons, the court considers that the conduct of Somalia between 1979 and 2014 in relation to its maritime boundary with Kenya, as just examined, in particular its alleged absence of protest against Kenya's claim, does not establish Somalia's clear and consistent acceptance of a maritime boundary at the parallel of latitude. The court then examines Kenya's argument that other conduct of the parties between 1979 and 2014, in particular their practice concerning naval patrols, fisheries, marine scientific research, and oil concessions, confirms Somalia's acceptance of a maritime boundary at the parallel of latitude. The court recalls that in the context of a maritime delimitation dispute, as for territorial disputes, the date on which the dispute crystallized is of significance. Acts occurring after such date are in principle irrelevant to the determination of a maritime boundary and cannot be taken into account, having been carried out by a state which, already having claims to assert an illegal dispute, could have taken those actions strictly with the aim of buttressing those claims. The court recalls that the MOU concluded by the parties in 2009 and Kenya's 2009 submission to the CLCS indicate that a maritime dispute existed between them as of 2009. Somalia has not provided the court with sufficient evidence to conclude that the dispute emerged before 2009. Accordingly, the court considers that the parties' activities after 2009 cannot be taken into account for the purpose of determining the maritime boundary. The court begins by considering the evidence of naval patrols. Maps depicting and logs recording Kenya's naval patrols and interceptions in the territorial sea show that some law enforcement activities were conducted by Kenya north of the equidistance line claimed by Somalia. Occasionally, however, there were also conducted north of the parallel of latitude that it claims as the maritime boundary. Kenya's naval patrols and interceptions were thus not necessarily consistent with its maritime boundary claim. Moreover, one of the maps submitted by Kenya is marked secret, and the remaining evidence does not establish that Somalia had knowledge of these activities. For the reasons given in the judgment, the court considers that the evidence on fisheries and marine scientific research activities also does not support Kenya's claim. As regards oil concessions, the court notes that the parties have established offshore oil concession blocks employing different lines since the 1970s. However, the parties have referred only to limited practice that took place before 2009. For the most part, the parties have referred to practice after 2009, which, for the reasons previously explained, is irrelevant to the determination of the maritime boundary. The court notes Kenya's argument that the conduct of the parties, including with respect to oil concessions, reflects the existence of a de facto maritime boundary. Even assuming that the limited evidence of practice before 2009 could be taken to suggest that a de facto line along the parallel of latitude may have been used by the parties for the location of oil concession blocks, at least for some time, the court observes that this may have been simply the manifestation of caution exercised by the parties in granting their concessions. The court also recalls that a de facto line might in certain circumstances correspond to the existence of an agreed legal boundary, or might be more in the nature of a provisional line, or of a line for a specific limited purpose, such as sharing a scarce resource. The court considers that proof of the existence of a maritime boundary requires more than the demonstration of long-standing oil practice or adjoining oil concessions. For these reasons, the court considers that other conduct of the parties between 1979 and 2014 does not confirm that Somalia has clearly and consistently accepted a maritime boundary at the parallel of latitude. In conclusion, the court finds that there is no compelling evidence that Somalia has acquiesced to the maritime boundary claimed by Kenya, and that consequently, there is no agreed maritime boundary between the parties at the parallel of latitude. Kenya's claim in this respect must therefore be rejected. In view of the conclusion just stated, the court turns to the delimitation of the maritime areas appertaining to Somalia and Kenya. In its application, Somalia requested the court to determine on the basis of international law the complete course of the single maritime boundary dividing all the maritime areas appertaining to Somalia and to Kenya in the Indian Ocean, including the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. Both Somalia and Kenya are parties to UNCLOS. The provisions of the convention must therefore be applied by the court in determining the course of the maritime boundary between the two states. The court begins by identifying the starting point of the maritime boundary. Although the parties initially preferred divergent views on the appropriate approach to defining the starting point to the maritime boundary, those views evolved in the course of the proceedings and are now, by and large, concordant. Taking into account the views of the parties, the court considers that the starting point of the maritime boundary is to be determined by connecting the final permanent beacon of the parties' land boundary, known as primary beacon number 29 or PB29, to a point on the low water line by a straight line that runs in a southeasterly direction and is perpendicular to the general trend of the coastline at Dar es Salaam, in accordance with the terms of the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement. The starting point is illustrated on sketch map number 3 in the judgment. The court next addresses the delimitation of the territorial sea. It notes that Somalia submits that the delimitation of the territorial sea is to be effected pursuant to Article 15 of the Convention, whereas Kenya argues that the maritime boundary, including the part in the territorial sea, already exists and that it follows the parallel of latitude. The court has already concluded that no such boundary was agreed by the parties. The court also notes that Kenya, in its counter-memorial, referred to the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement and stated that it, I quote, provided for the establishment of a boundary in the territorial sea, end of quote. The court notes that neither party asks it to confirm the existence of any segment of the maritime boundary or to delimit the boundary in the territorial sea on the basis of the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement. It recalls that in their legislation concerning the territorial sea, neither party has referred to the terms of the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement to indicate the extent of the territorial sea in relation to its adjacent neighbor. Kenya's legislation has referred to a median or equidistance line, and Somalia's maritime law of 1988 refers to a straight line towards the sea from the land as indicated on the enclosed charts. The court further notes that the agenda of the meeting between Somalia and Kenya, held on 26 and 27 March 2014 to discuss the maritime boundary between the two countries, covered all maritime zones, including the territorial sea. The delegations discussed several options and methods for determining the maritime boundary, although they could not reach agreement. In a presentation examining an equity-based maritime boundary scenario, which is attached to the joint report on that meeting, Kenya referred to Articles 15, 74, and 83 of the Convention as relevant to the maritime delimitation. It emphasized that Article 15 provides for a delimitation through a median line for the territorial sea, unless there is agreement to the contrary based on a claim by historic title or special circumstances. The court therefore considers it unnecessary to decide whether the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement had as an objective the delimitation of the boundary of the territorial sea. The court then recalls that the delimitation methodology is based on the geography of the coast of the two states concerned, and that a median or equidistance line is constructed using base points appropriate to that geography. Although in the identification of base points the court will have regard to the proposals of the parties, it need not select a particular base point, even if the parties are in agreement thereon, if it does not consider that base point to be appropriate. The court may select a base point that neither party has proposed. The court further recalls that it has sometimes been led to eliminate the disproportionate effect of small islands by not selecting a base point on such small maritime features. As the court has stated in the past, there may be situations in which the equitableness of an equidistance line depends on whether precaution is taken of eliminating the disproportionate effect of certain islets, rocks, or minor coastal projections. In the circumstances of the present case, the court considers it appropriate to place base points for the construction of the median line solely on solid land on the mainland coast of the parties. It does not consider it appropriate to place base points on the tiny arid Dua Damaskia islets, which would have a disproportionate impact on the course of the median line in comparison to the size of these features. For similar reasons, the court does not consider it appropriate to select a base point on a low tide elevation off the southern tip of Ras Kamboni, which is a minor protuberance in Somalia's otherwise relatively straight coastline in the vicinity of the land boundary terminus, which constitutes the starting point of the maritime delimitation. The court then provides the geographical coordinates of the appropriate base points selected on the parties' coasts used to construct the median line. The resulting line starts from the land boundary terminus and continues to the point A, at the distance of 12 nautical miles from the coast. That median line is depicted on sketch map number 5 and continues to the point A, at the distance of 12 nautical miles from the coast. That median line is depicted on sketch map number 5, now shown on screen. The court observes that the course of that median line corresponds closely to the course of a line at right angles to the general trend of the coastline, assuming that the 1927-1933 treaty arrangement, in using this phrase, had as an objective to draw a line that continues into the territorial sea, a question that the court need not decide. The court then proceeds to the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf within 200 nautical miles from the coast of the parties. The relevant provisions of the Convention for this exercise are contained in Article 74 of UNCLOS for the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and Article 83 for the delimitation of the continental shelf. These provisions are of a very general nature and do not provide much by way of guidance for those involved in maritime delimitation exercise. The goal of that exercise is the achievement of an equitable solution. If two states have freely agreed on a maritime boundary, they are deemed to have achieved such an equitable solution. However, if they fail to reach agreement on their maritime boundary and the matter is submitted to the court, it is the task of the court to find an equitable solution in the maritime delimitation it has been requested to effect. Since the adoption of the convention, the court has gradually developed a maritime delimitation methodology to assist it in carrying out its task. In determining the maritime delimitation line, the court proceeds in three stages, which it described in the case concerning maritime delimitation in the Black Sea, Romania versus Ukraine. In the first stage, the court will establish the provisional equidistance line from the most appropriate base points on the coast of the parties. The court will, in the second stage, consider whether there are factors calling for the adjustment or shifting of the provisional equidistance line in order to achieve the adjusted line to the disproportionality test. The purpose of this test is to assure the court that there is no marked disproportion between the ratio of the lengths of the relevant coasts of the parties and the ratio of their respective shares of the parties in the relevant area to be delimited by the envisaged line, and thus to confirm that the delimitation achieves an equitable solution as required by the convention. The court observes that the three-stage methodology is not prescribed by the convention and therefore is not mandatory. It has been developed by the court in its jurisprudence on maritime delimitation as part of its effort to arrive at an equitable solution as required by Articles 74 and 83 of the convention. The methodology is based on objective geographical criteria, while at the same time taking into account any relevant circumstances bearing on the equitableness of the maritime boundary. It has brought predictability to the process of maritime delimitation and has been applied by the court in a number of past cases. The three-stage methodology for maritime delimitation has also been used by international tribunals. The court will not use the three-stage methodology if there are factors which make the application of the equidistance method inappropriate. For instance, if the construction of an equidistance line from the coast is not feasible. This, however, is not the case in the present circumstances, where such a line can be constructed. Moreover, the court does not consider the use of a parallel of latitude as the appropriate methodology to achieve an equitable solution as suggested by Kenya. A boundary along the parallel of latitude would produce a severe cutoff effect on the maritime projections of the southernmost coast of Somalia. The court therefore sees no reason in the present case to depart from its usual practice of using the three-stage methodology to establish the maritime boundary between Somalia and Kenya in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf. The court first identifies the relevant coasts of the parties, namely those coasts whose projections overlap. The court, using radial projections which overlap within 200 nautical miles, has identified that the relevant coast of Somalia extends for approximately 733 kilometers and that of Kenya for approximately 511 kilometers. The court notes that the parties disagree as to the identification of the relevant area. The court has explained on a number of occasions that the relevant area comprises that part of the maritime space in which the potential entitlements of the parties overlap. The court also recalls its observation that the relevant area cannot extend beyond the area in which the entitlements of both parties overlap. The court is of the view that in the north, the relevant area extends as far as the overlap of the maritime projections of the coast of Kenya and the coast of Somalia. The court considers it appropriate to use the overlap of the 200 nautical mile radial projections area as identified by the court for the purpose of delimiting the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles from the coast, measures approximately 212,844 square kilometers. The court next constructs the provisional equidistance line. It first identifies the base points it considers appropriate for the construction of the provisional equidistance line within 200 nautical miles of the coast. The provisional equidistance line is constructed on the basis of these base points, and it begins from the endpoint of the maritime boundary in the territorial sea, point A, and continues until it reaches 200 nautical miles from the starting point of the maritime boundary, at a point with the coordinates indicated in the judgment. The resulting line is depicted on sketch map 9, which is now shown on the screen. The court next considers whether there are factors requiring the adjustment or shifting of the provisional equidistance line in order to achieve an equitable solution. The court recalls that Kenya perceives the provisional equidistance line as inequitable, while Somalia does not see any plausible reason for adjusting the line and believes that it would constitute an equitable boundary. The court notes that Kenya, by invoking various factors which it considers as constituting relevant circumstances in the context of this case, has consistently sought a maritime boundary that would follow the parallel of latitude. The court has already concluded that no maritime boundary between Somalia and Kenya following the parallel of latitude was established in the past. Nor has the court accepted the methodology based on the parallel of latitude for establishing the maritime boundary between the parties as advocated by Kenya. Kenya would now like to achieve the same result by a major shifting of the provisional equidistance line, changing its southeasterly direction to an exclusively easterly direction. The court considers that such a shifting of the provisional equidistance line, as argued for by Kenya, would result in a radical adjustment.
Oh, shut up. Why?